My ex-wife's new husband stole my login to access my files, but I had already replaced them with fake data. That would destroy his career, and now he's presenting my trap to the CEO while I sit in the front row waiting for the exact moment his lies explode. You know that feeling when you're the guy who fixes everything but gets credit for nothing? Yeah, that's been my life for the past decade. My name is Miles Corbin, and I'm 38 years old, though some days I feel like I'm pushing 50 with all the crap I've been dealing with. I'm what they call a lead data architect at this massive tech consultancy called OmniVault Solutions. Sounds fancy, right? Don't let the title fool you. I'm basically the guy they call when their systems are on fire and nobody else knows how to put out the flames. For years, I've been working in the shadows, solving data disasters that would make grown executives cry. While other people were schmoozing at happy hours and playing weekend golf with the C-suite, I was buried in spreadsheets at midnight, untangling code that looked like it was written by drunk monkeys. I wasn't the guy with the flashy presentations or the smooth PowerPoint skills. I didn't have that fake-it-till-you-make-it charm that seems to get people promoted around here. I was just the quiet dude in the corner office who could make sense of chaos when everyone else was running around like headless chickens. My reward for all this dedication? Getting passed over for leadership roles again and again, watching mediocre people climb the ladder while I stayed stuck in the same position. It's like being the best player on a losing team. You know you're good, but nobody seems to care. I watch guys with half my experience and a quarter of my skills get promoted to director positions while I kept getting the same bullshit feedback. Miles, you're incredibly talented, but we need someone with more presence. Translation, we need someone who kisses ass better than you do. But the real kick in the teeth wasn't professional, it was personal. Harper, my wife of 7 years, decided she'd had enough of being married to a guy who wasn't ambitious enough. Those were her exact words during our last fight before she filed for divorce. Ambitious enough. Like fixing million-dollar data disasters every other week wasn't ambitious. Like being the go-to guy when billion-dollar deals hung in the balance wasn't enough ambition for her. She wanted someone who talked a big game. Someone who made grand gestures and big promises, even if they couldn't deliver half of what they claimed. 6 months after our divorce was finalized, Harper married Brent Halden. This guy is everything I'm not. Loud, charming in that slimy car salesman way, and completely full of shit. He calls himself a strategy guru, which is basically corporate speak for, I don't actually do anything, but I'm really good at talking about doing things. The man couldn't read a pivot table if his life depended on it, but he could sell ice to Eskimos and make them feel grateful for the opportunity. Here's the real kicker that still makes my blood boil. 3 months after Harper and Brent got married, guess who landed a top executive position at my company? That's right, Brent fucking Halden, my ex-wife's new husband, strutting into OmniVault Solutions like he owned the place. And not just any position, either. They brought him in to lead a flagship project that I had built from scratch, spending 2 years of my life developing the architecture, the data models, the entire framework that was going to revolutionize how we handled client analytics. I remember the day they announced his hiring. I was sitting in the weekly all-hands meeting, half listening to our CEO Cynthia Arledge drone on about exciting new leadership additions, when she introduced Brent as our new Director of Strategic Innovation. The irony wasn't lost on me. The project he was hired to lead was literally called Project Atlas, and I had named it that because it was supposed to carry the weight of our entire data architecture division on its shoulders. Watching Brent shake hands with executives who barely knew my name, seeing him flash that practice smile while talking about revolutionary approaches to data synthesis, words he'd obviously memorized from some business magazine, made me want to punch something. Here was a guy who probably couldn't spell algorithm correctly getting handed the keys to my life's work, while I sat there invisible as always, just another face in the crowd. The worst part? Harper was right there in the front row during the company-wide announcement, beaming with pride like she'd won the lottery. She caught my eye once during Brent's little acceptance speech, and I swear I saw a flicker of smugness in her expression, like she was saying, see, this is what real ambition looks like. This is what you could never be. That night, I went home to my empty apartment, the same crappy one-bedroom I'd been renting since the divorce because Harper got the house in the settlement, and I sat there drinking beer and staring at my laptop screen. I pulled up the Project Atlas files, all the work I'd done, All the late nights and weekend hours I'd invested in building something that was supposed to change everything. And now it belonged to a fraud who wouldn't know real data analysis if it bit him on his perfectly groomed ass. But as I sat there feeling sorry for myself, something started brewing in the back of my mind. A little voice that said maybe, just maybe, being invisible had its advantages. Maybe being the guy nobody paid attention to meant I could do things that nobody would see coming. Maybe it was time to stop being the forgotten man and start being the guy who remembered everything. I closed my laptop and went to bed that night with a strange feeling in my chest. Not defeat, but something else entirely. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. The first time I saw Brent strutting through the Omnivault offices, I wanted to laugh. The guy walked like he was modeling for some corporate lifestyle magazine. Chest puffed out, designer suit perfectly tailored, that ridiculous confident stride that screamed, "I'm important, and you should know it." Everything about him was calculated for maximum impact. From his expensive cologne that followed him like a cloud to his perfectly styled hair that probably took longer to fix than most people's entire morning routine. What made it even more infuriating was watching how everyone reacted to him. Suddenly, conversations would stop mid-sentence when he walked by. Administrative assistants who'd barely acknowledged my existence for years were practically falling over themselves to get his attention. "Good morning, Mr. Halden," they'd chirp, like he was some kind of celebrity who'd graced them with his presence. Meanwhile, I could walk past the same people every day for a decade and get maybe a polite nod if I was lucky. Brent had this way of making every interaction feel like a performance. He'd lean against door frames during meetings, gesture dramatically when he talked, and throw around buzzwords like confetti at a New Year's party. Synergistic solutions, paradigm shifts, disruptive innovation. The guy was like a walking business cliché generator. And the worst part? People ate it up. They nodded seriously when he talked about leveraging core competencies and optimizing deliverable matrices. Even though half the time I'm pretty sure he was just stringing together random corporate jargon. The reality was that Brent couldn't read a pivot table if his life depended on it. I'd watched him during his first few team meetings, squinting at spreadsheets like they were written in ancient hieroglyphics. When someone would present actual data, real numbers, statistical analyses, trend projections, his eyes would glaze over within 30 seconds. But ask him to talk about strategic vision or market positioning, and suddenly he was the most eloquent guy in the room. It's like he had this supernatural ability to take complex technical concepts and distill them down into feel-good nonsense that executives loved hearing. "We're not just processing data," he'd say with that practiced smile. "We're unlocking the DNA of consumer behavior." The engineering team would exchange looks like they wanted to strangle him, but the C-suite would be scribbling notes like he'd just revealed the secrets of the universe. But here's where things got interesting, and by interesting, I mean completely fucked up. About 3 weeks into Brent's reign as Director of Strategic Innovation, I started noticing some weird stuff happening with my computer access. At first, it was little things, files that seemed to have been opened when I knew I'd closed them, folders that looked like they'd been reorganized slightly, that kind of thing. You know that feeling when you walk into your apartment and something just feels off? Even though nothing's obviously out of place, but your gut tells you someone's been messing with your stuff? That's exactly what this felt like. Then came the day that changed everything. I'd gone out for lunch. Nothing fancy, just grabbed a sandwich from the deli down the street and ate it in the little park across from our building. It was one of those rare, beautiful days where the weather was perfect and I actually felt like getting some fresh air instead of eating another sad desk lunch while staring at code. I was gone maybe 45 minutes, tops. When I got back to my desk, my computer was still logged in, which wasn't unusual since I rarely logged out during the day. But something felt wrong. The screen looked exactly like I'd left it, but there was this nagging feeling in the back of my head that made me check my recent file activity. That's when I saw it. A whole bunch of files in my Project Atlas directory had been accessed while I was out. Not just opened, but downloaded, copied, stolen. My heart started pounding as I dug deeper into the access logs. Someone had been browsing through my most sensitive datasets. The core algorithms I'd spent months perfecting, the client analysis frameworks that were the backbone of our entire operation, even some preliminary models I'd been working on for future projects. This wasn't some accidental click or casual browsing. This was systematic, methodical data theft. The really sick part was how professional the theft was. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for. They hadn't wasted time on random files or gotten distracted by irrelevant folders. They'd gone straight for the good stuff, the high-level datasets that represented years of my work, the kind of proprietary information that could make or break million-dollar contracts. Only a handful of people had the password to my company account, and most of them were IT administrators who had better things to do than steal my files. But there was one person who had legitimate access, someone I'd trusted completely during our marriage, someone who'd watched me work late into the night on these exact projects. Harper, my ex-wife, who was now married to the guy who'd been hired to lead the very project these files belonged to. The pieces started falling into place like dominoes. Brent arrives at the company. Brent gets put in charge of Project Atlas. Brent suddenly needs access to detailed technical specifications that he definitely doesn't have the skills to create himself. And conveniently, his new wife just happens to have insider access to exactly the information he needs. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at the access logs, feeling this weird mix of rage and clarity. I'd always known Brent was a fraud, but now I had proof that he was also a thief. The question was, what the hell was I going to do about it? I started by resetting everything. New passwords, new security protocols, encrypted folders for anything sensitive. Then I began designing something I'd never attempted before, the perfect trap. If Brent wanted to steal my work, I was going to give him exactly what he deserved. You know what they say about revenge being a dish best served cold? Well, I was about to serve up a 5-course meal that had been chilling in the freezer for months. The beauty of being a data architect is that I understand exactly how information flows through systems, how people make decisions based on numbers, and most importantly, how to make those numbers lie convincingly. I spent the entire weekend holed up in my apartment, surviving on energy drinks and leftover Chinese takeout, crafting what I like to think of as my masterpiece of digital deception. In a hidden folder deep within my work directory, titled Project Atlas, Final Deck, I created 6 files that would make Brent's mouth water. To anyone glancing at them, these looked like the holy grail of data analysis. Polished charts, sophisticated dashboards, complex projections that seemed to predict the future of our industry. The first file was a seasonal inventory analysis that looked absolutely brilliant on the surface. I'd spend hours making sure the visualizations were perfect, clean graphs, professional color schemes, impressive-looking statistical models. But here's the thing. Every single formula was deliberately, carefully, catastrophically wrong. I reversed seasonal trends so that it recommended stocking winter coats in July and swimwear in December. The algorithm suggested that people in Minnesota would suddenly develop an insatiable appetite for beach volleyball equipment right around Christmas time. The second file focused on customer churn analysis, and this one was my personal favorite. I created models that made our most loyal clients look like they were about to jump ship, while portraying our worst customers as golden geese just waiting to lay million-dollar eggs. The data suggested that retired couples in their 70s were suddenly the hottest demographic for extreme sports equipment, while college students apparently had zero interest in affordable tech gadgets. It was so backwards it would have been hilarious if it wasn't about to ruin someone's career. Then came the pricing strategies. Oh man, this was where I really let my creative side shine. I designed models that would price products so aggressively that they'd literally bankrupt any company stupid enough to implement them. We're talking about selling premium software licenses for the same price as a cup of coffee, while charging luxury car prices for basic data storage. The profit margins were so insane that any accountant worth their salt would spot the problems within minutes. But to someone who didn't understand numbers, it probably looked like we'd discovered some revolutionary new business model. The customer satisfaction metrics were another work of art. According to my fake data, clients absolutely loved being overcharged and ignored. Apparently, the more we raised prices and reduced service quality, the happier they became. The correlation charts showed that customer loyalty increased exponentially with every complaint they filed. It was like claiming that people enjoyed root canals so much they'd pay extra for longer, more painful procedures. But here's where I got really devious. Each file carried my old naming conventions and subtle metadata signatures that would trace back to me if anyone bothered to look closely. I embedded timestamps, version numbers, and even some of my personal coding quirks that any forensic analysis would pick up immediately. To a casual observer, These files looked like legitimate work product. To anyone who knew what to look for, they screamed, "Miles Corbin created this." Of course, I wasn't completely insane. While I was crafting these digital landmines, I also created clean versions of the real analysis and stored them in my encrypted personal drive. These were the actual projections based on sound methodology, proper seasonal adjustments, realistic customer behavior models, and pricing strategies that might actually work in the real world. Every assumption was documented, every calculation was verified, and every conclusion was backed up by solid data. This was my insurance policy, proof that I knew exactly what I was doing and that any disasters that followed weren't the result of incompetence. The real genius of the trap was in the details. I made sure the fake files looked exactly like something I would have created 6 months earlier, complete with the same formatting styles, chart layouts, and analytical approaches I'd been using throughout the Project Atlas development. If someone stole these files and tried to pass them off as their own work, they'd be claiming ownership of something that was clearly, undeniably, traceable back to me. I even went so far as to create fake email drafts discussing these analyses, complete with timestamps that would show I'd been working on this research during periods when I had legitimate reasons to be accessing client data. The paper trail was so convincing that anyone investigating would conclude I'd been developing these insights as part of my regular duties, right up until the moment they realized the insights were completely worthless. The final touch was making sure these files were stored in locations where they'd be easy to find, but not so obvious that they'd seem like bait. I nested them in subdirectories that looked like they contained my most valuable work, mixed in with enough legitimate files to make the whole collection seem authentic. It was like hiding poison pills in a candy store. Everything looked delicious until you actually tried to use it. By Sunday night, my trap was set. 6 beautiful, deadly, completely fraudulent files just waiting for the right thief to come along and grab them. All I had to do now was sit back and wait for Brent to take the bait. Monday morning came with that electric feeling you get when you know something big is about to go down. I grabbed my usual black coffee from the lobby cafe and settled into my desk, trying to look as normal as possible while my heart was practically hammering against my ribcage. The trap was set, the files were in place, and now all I had to do was wait to see if Brent would be stupid enough to walk right into it. I didn't have to wait long. Within 24 hours of setting up my little digital mousetrap, I got the show I'd been hoping for. I was sitting in on our weekly team strategy call, one of those mind-numbing video conferences where everyone pretends to care about quarterly projections while secretly checking their email. Our CEO, Cynthia Arledge, was droning on about market penetration metrics when Brent suddenly perked up like a dog who'd heard a can opener. "Actually, Cynthia, I've been working on some game-changing insights that I think everyone needs to see," he announced with that trademark smile that made me want to punch something. The guy had this way of inserting himself into conversations that reminded me of those obnoxious people who cut in line at Starbucks and then act like they'd been there the whole time. Before anyone could respond, Brent was screen sharing one of my dummy dashboards. My fake seasonal inventory analysis filled everyone's monitors, complete with all those beautiful, completely wrong charts I'd spent hours perfecting. Watching him present my deliberately sabotaged work was like watching someone confidently walk off a cliff while bragging about their excellent sense of direction. "These projections show some fascinating counter-seasonal trends," Brent continued, gesturing at the screen like he was revealing the mysteries of the universe. "We're seeing unprecedented demand for beach volleyball equipment during winter months, particularly in northern markets like Minnesota and Wisconsin." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud. Ramon Taggart, our COO, was squinting at his screen with this confused expression like he was trying to solve a particularly difficult math problem. But Brent just kept rolling, completely oblivious to how insane his presentation sounded. "The data clearly indicates that retired demographics are driving extreme sports adoption," he said, clicking to another one of my sabotage charts. "We're looking at 70-plus-year-olds showing remarkable enthusiasm for bungee jumping equipment and rock climbing gear." The beautiful thing about Brent's personality was that his confidence was so overwhelming. It actually made other people doubt their own common sense. I watched Cynthia nodding thoughtfully, probably thinking she was missing some brilliant strategic insight rather than recognizing that she was listening to complete bullshit. It's amazing how a fancy PowerPoint presentation and a confident voice can make even smart people ignore obvious red flags. Throughout the entire presentation, I played my part perfectly. I sat there nodding quietly, occasionally jotting down fake notes, doing my best impression of a guy who was genuinely interested in his colleagues' innovative analysis. Meanwhile, I was running a background Python script that was tracking every single thing Brent did with those files, when he accessed them, how long he spent reviewing each section, what modifications he made. The best part came when Brent started taking credit for the work. Not subtly, either. This guy went full ownership mode. After extensive analysis of the data patterns, he said, "I've identified some remarkable opportunities that I believe will revolutionize our approach to seasonal inventory management." He didn't even try to acknowledge me or anyone else who might have contributed to the research. He renamed the files right there during the presentation, saving them in a folder marked BH, Final Client Materials. The metadata trail I was collecting was getting more beautiful by the minute. Every click, every save, every time he copied text from my original files into his own documents. I had it all recorded with timestamps that would make a forensic accountant weep with joy. What really got me was watching him strip away all the original metadata from my files and replace it with his own digital signature. It was like watching someone carefully erase the artist's name from a painting and then signing their own name in the corner. The arrogance was breathtaking, but it was also exactly what I needed him to do. After the call ended, I sat there for a few minutes just processing what had happened. Brent had taken my bait so completely, so enthusiastically, that it almost felt too easy. But then I remembered all those months of being invisible, all those times he'd strutted past my desk like I didn't exist, all those conversations where he'd dismissed my actual expertise while building his reputation on stolen work. That afternoon, I expanded my monitoring setup. I created additional tracking scripts that would follow those files wherever they went. If Brent forwarded them to clients, uploaded them to shared drives, or presented them in other meetings, I'd know about it within minutes. I also started documenting everything in a separate encrypted folder, creating a timeline that showed exactly when the files were accessed, modified, and distributed. By the end of that week, I had enough digital evidence to prove theft, fraud, and professional misconduct. But I wasn't ready to pull the trigger yet. I wanted to see just how far Brent would take this, how big the lie would grow before it finally collapsed under its own weight. Over the next few weeks, I watched Brent's confidence grow like a cancer. The guy was riding high on what he thought was his brilliant strategic analysis, strutting around the office with even more swagger than usual. It was like watching someone get drunk on their own bullshit, and honestly, it was both fascinating and terrifying to see how far he was willing to push this lie. The first sign that things were escalating came during our monthly client review meeting. Brent had apparently been shopping my fake analysis around to various department heads, building what he called consensus around the revolutionary insights. The way he talked about it, you'd think he'd discovered fire or invented the wheel. Every conversation I overheard was peppered with phrases like my groundbreaking research and the paradigm shift I've identified in consumer behavior patterns. What really made my blood boil was listening to him explain concepts that I deliberately made nonsensical, watching him spin complete garbage into something that sounded almost plausible. When someone questioned why retirees would suddenly start buying extreme sports equipment, Brent would launch into these elaborate theories about active aging demographics and the adventure-seeking baby boomer revolution. The man could take a pile of dog shit and somehow make it sound like premium fertilizer. But the real moment of truth came when Cynthia announced that we'd landed a presentation opportunity with Viridian Outfitters, a massive outdoor gear company that represented potentially our biggest contract ever. We're talking about a $25 million deal that could set our company up for the next 5 years. And guess who volunteered to lead the pitch using his innovative market analysis? I'll never forget the smugness in Brent's voice when he announced it during our Thursday team meeting. "I've been working closely with Viridian's executive team," he said, like he was some kind of corporate diplomat brokering international treaties. "They're extremely interested in the seasonal trend reversals and demographic shifts I've identified. This could be the breakthrough that transforms how the entire outdoor industry thinks about inventory management." The scary part was that people were actually buying into this bullshit. I watched seasoned professionals, people who'd been in this business for decades, nodding along as Brent described market conditions that would have been laughable to anyone who'd spent 5 minutes actually studying retail patterns. But his confidence was so absolute, his presentation skills so polished, that he made fantasy sound like fact. I started getting more aggressive with my monitoring during this period. Every email Brent sent, every document he shared, every presentation he scheduled, I was tracking all of it. My Python scripts were working overtime, creating detailed logs that showed exactly how my poison data was spreading through the company's communication channels. It was like watching a virus replicate itself, and I was the only one who knew how deadly the infection was going to be. The really twisted part was that Brent had scheduled the Viridian presentation for a full board meeting. Not just a casual pitch to some mid-level executives, but a formal presentation to their CEO, their board of directors, and their entire senior leadership team. This wasn't going to be some small embarrassment that could be swept under the rug. This was going to be a corporate disaster witnessed by some of the most powerful people in the outdoor retail industry. During this whole period, I kept getting these text messages from Harper that made me want to throw my phone against the wall. She'd apparently been hearing about Brent's success at work and felt the need to share her thoughts with me. "You should be proud," she texted one evening. "Brent's turning your old project into something huge. Maybe you can learn something about real leadership from watching him." The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Here was my ex-wife praising her new husband for stealing my work, while simultaneously criticizing me for not being ambitious enough. She had no idea that the huge success she was celebrating was built entirely on sabotage data that was about to explode in the most spectacular way possible. I didn't reply to her messages, partly because I knew anything I said would just make me look bitter and pathetic, but mainly because I was saving my energy for the main event. Every day that passed, every email Brent sent promoting his revolutionary insights, every meeting where he presented my fake analysis as gospel truth, it was all just adding more evidence to the case I was building. The beautiful thing about letting this situation develop naturally was that Brent was digging his own grave deeper with every shovel full of dirt. By the time I was ready to reveal the truth, there would be no way for him to claim it was a misunderstanding or an honest mistake. The paper trail was becoming so extensive, so clearly documented, that any investigation would show a pattern of deliberate theft and fraud that went on for weeks. As the date for the Viridian presentation approached, I found myself almost feeling sorry for the guy. Almost. Then I'd remember how he'd stolen my work, how he'd dismissed my contributions, how he'd married my ex-wife, and then used her access to rob me blind. The sympathy would evaporate pretty quickly after that. Friday afternoon hit like the calm before a hurricane. The whole office had this weird energy. You know that feeling when everyone knows something big is happening, but nobody wants to jinx it by talking about it too much? The Viridian presentation was scheduled for Monday morning at 9 sharp, and Brent had been strutting around all week like he was about to deliver the corporate equivalent of the Gettysburg Address. I was sitting at my desk, pretending to work on some routine database maintenance, while actually putting the finishing touches on what I like to think of as my insurance policy. The folder I'd been building over the past month was now a thing of beauty. A comprehensive timeline showing every single instance of Brent's theft, complete with access logs, timestamps, file modification records, and even screenshots of his presentations featuring my sabotage data. Around 3 o'clock, Brent wandered over to my desk with that predatory smile he usually reserved for impressing executives. The guy looked like he'd just won the lottery and was trying to decide which yacht to buy first. He leaned against my cubicle wall with that casual confidence that made my skin crawl, like we were old buddies sharing war stories instead of him being a thief talking to his victim. "Big day coming up, Miles," he said, adjusting his silk tie like he was posing for a magazine cover. "I know you'll be in the front row Monday morning, watching the presentation that's going to change everything for this company." The balls on this guy were absolutely incredible. Here he was, essentially bragging about stealing my work while standing right in front of me, acting like I should be grateful to witness his moment of triumph. It was like a bank robber calling the bank manager to thank them for making the heist so convenient. "Wouldn't miss it for the world," I replied, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. Inside, I was practically vibrating with anticipation, but I'd gotten pretty good at hiding my emotions over the past few weeks. Years of being invisible in corporate meetings had taught me how to keep a poker face when it really mattered. Brent's grin got even wider, if that was possible. Just don't make things awkward, you know? I know this project started in your department, but sometimes the best ideas need the right person to bring them to life. That's just how business works. The right person to bring them to life. Jesus Christ, the audacity was breathtaking. This was like someone stealing your car and then lecturing you about how they're a better driver anyway. I nodded and gave him a smile that I hoped looked supportive rather than homicidal. And thankfully, he wandered off to go bother someone else with his pre-victory celebration. That weekend, I turned into a man on a mission. Saturday morning, I drove to my local FedEx office and spent 3 hours creating the most comprehensive evidence package I'd ever assembled. I printed out every access log, every timestamp, every piece of digital forensic evidence that proved Brent's theft. The stack of papers was thick enough to use as a doorstop, and every page told the same story: systematic, deliberate, undeniable fraud. But the centerpiece of my evidence package was a bound copy of my actual analysis, the real Project Atlas data that I'd been working on for the past 2 years. While Brent was preparing to present complete fiction to the Viridian board, I had the truth sitting right there in black and white. Real seasonal trends, legitimate demographic analysis, pricing strategies that actually made sense. Everything that Brent's stolen data wasn't. The contrast was going to be devastating. Anyone who saw both versions side by side would immediately understand not just that Brent had stolen my work, but that he'd stolen the wrong version and was about to humiliate himself on a scale that would become company legend. Sunday evening, I took out another insurance policy that I hoped I wouldn't need, but wasn't taking any chances on. I drafted a detailed email to my lawyer, a guy named Steve Patterson who'd handled my divorce and had seen enough of my documentation skills to know I wasn't the type to make wild accusations without solid proof. The email contained copies of all my evidence, a timeline of events, and instructions to open a formal investigation if anything happened to me or my employment status in the coming weeks. It felt paranoid, but I'd learned not to underestimate what desperate people might do when their careers were on the line. If Brent or Harper or anyone else tried to retaliate once the truth came out, I wanted to make sure there was a paper trail that would protect me. Steve's automated reply confirmed that the email had been received and archived, giving me one more layer of security. Monday morning was coming whether I was ready or not, and honestly, I'd never felt more prepared for anything in my entire life. I had the evidence, I had the real analysis, and most importantly, I had front row seats to watch a fraud finally get what was coming to him. The only question left was whether Brent would realize how badly he'd screwed himself before or after he started presenting my poison data to one of the biggest clients in our company's history. Monday morning, 9 a.m. sharp. I'd been awake since 5:30, not because I set an alarm, but because my brain refused to let me sleep past the point where I could pretend this wasn't really happening. I grabbed the strongest coffee the lobby cafe had to offer, a triple shot that tasted like liquid determination, and made my way to conference room A, our biggest boardroom that usually only got used for the most important client meetings. The room was already buzzing with nervous energy when I walked in. Omnivault's entire senior leadership team was there. Cynthia Arledge looking crisp and professional in her power suit, Ramon Taggart reviewing notes on his tablet, and about 6 other executives I rarely interacted with, but who collectively controlled the future of our company. They'd arranged themselves along one side of the massive oak conference table like they were preparing for treaty negotiations. But the real show was on the other side of the table. 12 people from Viridian Outfitters, all dressed in that expensive casual style that screams, "We have serious money, and we're not afraid to spend it." Their CEO, Dina Morales, sat right in the center. A woman in her 50s with silver hair and the kind of sharp eyes that suggested she'd eaten lesser executives for breakfast. Flanking her were board members, vice presidents, and strategic advisors who collectively represented one of the biggest opportunities our company had ever seen. I'd positioned myself in the front row of observer seats, close enough to see every facial expression, but far enough back to avoid being dragged into the conversation. My backup drive was in my laptop bag, my evidence folder was ready to go, and my heart was beating so hard I was worried people might actually hear it. Brent entered the room like he was walking onto a stage at Madison Square Garden. Designer suit perfectly pressed, hairstyled like he'd just stepped out of a men's magazine, carrying himself with the kind of confidence that made you either want to applaud or punch him in the face. He shook hands with everyone from Viridian, working the room like a politician at a campaign rally. "Thank you all for this incredible opportunity," Brent began, his voice carrying that practiced cadence of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in the mirror. "What I'm about to share with you represents a fundamental breakthrough in understanding seasonal consumer behavior patterns." The first few slides looked impressive. I had to give him credit for that. My sabotage charts were beautifully formatted. The color schemes were professional, and if you didn't actually understand what the numbers meant, you might think you were looking at cutting-edge market analysis. Brent clicked through the initial overview with the smooth confidence of a man who believed he was about to change the outdoor retail industry forever. "As you can see from our comprehensive data analysis," he continued, gesturing at a chart that showed winter coat sales peaking in July. "Traditional seasonal assumptions are being completely disrupted by evolving consumer preferences." That's when I noticed the first crack in the facade. Mark Sheffield, Viridian COO, was squinting at his copy of the presentation materials with the expression of someone trying to solve a particularly confusing puzzle. He leaned over to whisper something to Dina, who glanced at the screen and then back at her papers with what looked like growing concern. But Brent was just getting warmed up. He clicked to my fake demographic analysis, the one that suggested 70-year-old retirees were driving demand for extreme sports equipment. "The data clearly shows that mature demographics represent our fastest-growing market segment for high-adventure gear," he announced with absolute conviction. "I'm sorry," interrupted Dr. Patricia Vance, Viridian's head of market research, "but are you suggesting that senior citizens are suddenly buying rock climbing equipment?" "Not just buying it," Brent replied without missing a beat, "but driving unprecedented growth in categories we previously associated with much younger consumers." The numbers don't lie. The room was starting to feel different now. Those polite, attentive expressions were shifting into something more skeptical. I watched as several Viridian executives began comparing notes, pointing at specific sections of the presentation and shaking their heads slightly. Then came the moment that made my whole month of planning worth it. Brent clicked to his pricing strategy slide, the one where I'd recommended selling premium gear at prices that would bankrupt any company stupid enough to implement them. "Our analysis indicates optimal profit margins of 400% on basic inventory," Brent announced proudly, with premium items generating returns of up to 800%. The silence that followed was deafening. Dina Morales set down her pen and looked directly at Brent with the expression of someone who'd just been told that gravity was optional. "800% margins?" she asked slowly. "You're suggesting we sell a $50 camping tent for $400? "The market research supports premium positioning," Brent replied, though I noticed his confidence was starting to waver slightly. "What market research?" demanded Sheffield. "Boston's foot traffic drops 60% after September. Why are you projecting swimwear sales increases in Q4? Brent's smile was starting to look strained. "I believe in challenging conventional assumptions." "No." Dina cut him off, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "This isn't challenging assumptions. This is complete garbage." The silence in that boardroom was thick enough to choke on. Dina Morales was staring at Brent like he'd just told her that water flows uphill, and I could practically see the $25 million contract evaporating in real time. Brent's face had gone from confident presenter to deer in headlights faster than I'd ever seen anyone crash and burn in a corporate setting. But then something beautiful happened. Dina's laser focus shifted from Brent to Cynthia, and her voice carried the kind of authority that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. "This is the analysis your team is delivering?" she asked, holding up the presentation materials like they were contaminated evidence. "Because if this represents the quality of strategic thinking at OmniVault Solutions, we need to seriously reconsider this partnership." The temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees. I watched Cynthia's face go through several different expressions in rapid succession: confusion, embarrassment, and then that particular brand of executive rage that comes when someone has just fucked up a major deal in front of the entire leadership team. Cynthia's eyes swept the room, looking for someone to explain what the hell had just happened, and that's when her gaze landed on me. "Miles," she said, and I could hear the desperation beneath her professional tone. "Were you involved in this analysis?" This was it. The moment I'd been planning for weeks. The exact scenario I'd been hoping would play out. I stood up slowly, feeling like I was stepping onto a stage where I'd been waiting my entire career to perform. My backup drive felt heavy in my hand as I walked toward the front of the room. "Yes," I said, making sure my voice carried to every corner of the boardroom. In a different way than what's been presented. I could feel Brent's panic radiating from across the room like heat from a fire, but I kept my focus on Dina and the Viridian team. These were people who dealt with real numbers, real market conditions, real business decisions. They deserved better than the fiction they'd just been fed. "With your permission," I continued, looking directly at Dina, "I'd like to show you the actual analysis." The nod she gave me was sharp and immediate. "Please do." I walked to the presentation setup, unplugged Brent's laptop with what I hoped looked like professional efficiency rather than pure satisfaction, and connected my backup drive. One cable swap, and Brent's fantasy world disappeared from the screen like it had never existed. What replaced it was 2 years of my life's work. Real data, honest projections, analysis that actually made sense in the context of how human beings actually behave. The first slide alone showed the dramatic difference between what they'd just seen and what competent market research actually looked like. "Let me show you what the numbers really tell us." I began, clicking to my seasonal analysis. Q4 growth projections for outdoor gear in northern markets should be around 6%, not the 47% that was just presented. I watched as the Viridian executives leaned forward, their expressions shifting from skeptical to engaged. These were people who understood retail cycles, who knew that promising massive winter growth for summer products was either incompetence or fraud. "Your core demographic," I continued, clicking to my actual customer analysis, "remains millennials aged 25 to 40, particularly those with household incomes between $60,000 and $90,000. Not retirees looking for extreme sports equipment." Slide by slide, I rebuilt their confidence in what market analysis should actually look like. I showed them realistic inventory recommendations, cold weather gear ramping up for Q4, summer items clearing out through strategic pricing, seasonal adjustments that made sense for companies that actually wanted to stay in business. "Churn analysis indicates 84% retention rates among your premium customers," I explained, "with the highest satisfaction scores correlating to consistent product quality and reliable customer service. Not the fictional crisis scenarios you were just shown." The best part was watching how the room's energy changed as I presented real data. The Viridian team started taking notes again, asking intelligent questions about methodology and data sources. These weren't the confused, frustrated expressions they'd worn during Brent's presentation. These were professionals recognizing competent work when they saw it. But I wasn't done yet. The final piece of my presentation was the documentation trail, screenshots showing the unauthorized access to my files, timestamps proving when the data had been stolen, and metadata analysis that made it crystal clear where the original work had come from. "This analysis represents 18 months of development," I said, clicking through the evidence. "The files that were just presented to you were accessed without authorization from my secure directories, downloaded, and modified before being presented as original work." The silence that followed was different from the earlier confusion. This was the silence of people processing the implications of what they'd just learned, that they'd almost signed a major contract based on stolen, sabotage data presented by someone who had no idea what he was talking about. Dina looked at the evidence on screen, then at Brent, then back at me. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone making a decision that would reshape the entire meeting. "Can you run this project?" she asked me directly. The question hung in the air for about 3 seconds before I answered with more confidence than I'd felt in years. "Yes, with my own team, not as backup." Her smile was the first genuine expression I'd seen from anyone at Viridian all morning. "You've got it." The moment Dina said, "You've got it," I watched Brent's entire world implode in real time. It was like watching a building collapse in slow motion. First the foundation cracked, then the walls started buckling, and finally the whole structure came crashing down in a spectacular display of dust and debris. Brent's face went through about 6 different expressions in the span of 10 seconds. First came confusion, like he couldn't quite process what had just happened. Then recognition as it dawned on him that his stolen presentation had been completely replaced by the real thing. That was followed by panic as he realized everyone in the room now understood exactly what kind of fraud he was. But what came next was pure desperation, and that's when things got really ugly. Wait, 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 Brent stammered, practically jumping out of his chair like the room was on fire. He's framing me. This is a setup. Those files were corrupted. The data was compromised. Miles has been sabotaging this project from the beginning because he's jealous of my leadership role. The balls on this guy were absolutely incredible. Even caught red-handed with irrefutable evidence of theft and fraud, he was still trying to spin the situation like he was the victim. It was like watching someone get caught stealing a car and then claiming the real owner had planted it in their driveway. Cynthia's expression could have frozen lava. She'd been running OmniVault Solutions for 8 years, and I'd never seen her look angrier than she did in that moment. When she spoke, her voice was so controlled it was actually more terrifying than if she'd been screaming. "Brent," she said, each word precisely enunciated, "you're done." 2 words. That's all it took to end his career at our company. No dramatic confrontation, no lengthy explanation, just a simple statement of fact delivered with the kind of finality that left no room for argument or appeal. But Brent wasn't going down without a fight. "You can't do this," he protested, his voice getting higher and more frantic. "I have a contract. I have rights. This is clearly a conspiracy between Miles and his ex-wife to destroy my reputation. Harper told me about his vindictive behavior during their divorce." That's when Dina Morales stood up from her seat, and the entire room went silent. When the CEO of a $25 million client decides to speak, everyone else shuts the hell up and listens. "Mr. Halden," she said, her tone carrying the kind of authority that comes from running a successful company for 15 years, "I've been in this business long enough to recognize competence when I see it. What you presented today wasn't just wrong, it was dangerously incompetent. If we'd implemented those recommendations, they would have bankrupted our company within 2 quarters. She gestured toward the screen where my real analysis was still displayed. Mr. Corbin's work, on the other hand, demonstrates the kind of thorough, professional analysis that we expect from our strategic partners. The contrast between the 2 presentations makes it very clear who actually understands this industry." Brent tried one more desperate gambit. "The intellectual property rights for this project belong to me. Miles was working under my direction. These are derivative works based on my original strategic framework." "Stop." Cynthia's voice cut through his bullshit like a knife through butter. "Security will escort you out of the building. Your access cards have been deactivated, your company accounts have been suspended, and HR will be in touch regarding the formal termination process." Within minutes, 2 security guards appeared at the boardroom door. I'd seen these guys around the building for years. Professional, no-nonsense types who'd clearly dealt with this kind of situation before. They flanked Brent like he was a flight risk, which honestly, he probably was. As they escorted him toward the exit, Brent made one last attempt at damage control. "This isn't over," he called back toward the room. "My lawyers will be hearing about this. Corporate fraud, conspiracy, wrongful termination, you'll all be hearing from my legal team." Empty threats from a desperate man, but I have to admit they sent a little chill down my spine. Not because I was worried about his lawyers. I had enough documentation to bury him in any legal proceeding, but because it reminded me that cornered animals often do unpredictable things. After Brent was gone, the atmosphere in the boardroom completely changed. The Viridian team spent the next hour going through my real analysis in detail, asking smart questions about methodology and implementation timelines. These were the kinds of conversations I'd been hoping to have for years, discussions with people who actually understood the work and appreciated the complexity involved in getting it right. Dina pulled me aside during a coffee break. "I want you to know that what happened here today has actually strengthened our confidence in OmniVault Solutions," she said. "The fact that your company was willing to immediately correct course and put the right person in charge tells us everything we need to know about your organizational integrity." That afternoon, Cynthia officially promoted me to Director of Strategic Analytics. The corner office that came with the position had a view of the sound and enough space for the team I'd been dreaming of building. Sarah from data visualization, Devin from statistical modeling, and 3 other analysts who'd been overlooked just like me. They were all going to be part of something bigger now. Around 4 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a text from Harper. "What did you do?" For the first time in months, I actually smiled when I saw her name on my screen. I didn't reply immediately. I wanted to savor the moment a little longer. When I finally did respond, I kept it simple. I never replied. The invisible man was finally visible, and it felt better than I'd ever imagined it would. 3 days after Brent's spectacular flame out in the boardroom, my life had settled into a rhythm I'd never experienced before, the rhythm of actually being respected. My new corner office still felt surreal every time I walked into it. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sound, enough space for a proper conference table, and a door I could actually close when I needed to think. After years of working in a cramped cubicle where every conversation was public domain, having privacy felt like a luxury I'd never known I wanted. The Viridian project was moving forward better than I'd dared to hope. Sarah had already started building the visualization frameworks that would turn my data into presentations that actually made sense. Devin was running statistical models that revealed patterns I'd suspected but never had the resources to prove. For the first time in my career, I was working with people who understood what I was trying to accomplish and had the skills to help me get there. That's when Brent's email arrived. The subject line was simple: "We need to talk." The sender was a personal Gmail account I didn't recognize, but the name in the from field made it clear who was reaching out. I stared at the message preview for about 30 seconds before deleting it without opening it. My reply was even simpler than his subject line. No. One word. 3 letters. The most satisfying email I'd ever sent in my professional life. But Brent wasn't the type to take no for an answer. That much had become crystal clear over the past few months. 2 days later, another email appeared in my inbox. This one had a longer subject line: legal ramifications of false accusations. I deleted that one too, without bothering to read whatever desperate bullshit he'd written in the body. The third email came a week later. I never even opened it. Just seeing his name in my inbox was enough to remind me of everything I'd moved past, and I wasn't interested in letting him drag me back into that headspace. Delete. Block sender. Move on with my life. Meanwhile, the Viridian project was exceeding every expectation we'd set. The real data models I developed were proving their worth in ways that felt almost too good to be true. We launched the pilot program 2 weeks ahead of schedule, and the early results were showing exactly the kind of steady, sustainable growth that smart companies actually want. Not the fantasy hockey stick projections that impress people in boardrooms, but collapse in the real world. 6 months later, I was standing on a stage at the National Retail Analytics Conference, accepting an award for innovative data modeling. The paper I'd published based on the Viridian project had been selected as the year's most significant contribution to seasonal inventory optimization. Looking out at an audience of industry professionals who actually understood and appreciated the work felt like vindication I'd been waiting my entire career to experience. During the Q&A session after my presentation, Dina Morales stood up in the audience. "Mr. Corbin," she said, "your analysis not only met our revenue targets but exceeded them by 18%. Can you talk about how your approach differs from traditional seasonal modeling?" As I answered her question, explaining the methodology that had taken me 2 years to perfect, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the side monitors. The guy looking back at me was someone I barely recognized, confident, articulate, finally in his element. The invisible man was gone, replaced by someone who belonged exactly where he was. The industry recognition led to speaking opportunities, consulting offers, and job inquiries from companies I'd only dreamed of working with. But I wasn't going anywhere. OmniVault Solutions had finally become the place I'd always hoped it could be, and I had a team that made coming to work feel like something I chose rather than something I endured. Every once in a while, I'd wonder what Brent was doing with his life. Whether he'd found another company willing to take a chance on his particular brand of corporate bullshit. Whether Harper was still impressed with her strategic guru husband now that his strategy had been exposed as theft and fraud. But those thoughts never lasted long. I was too busy building something real to waste time thinking about people who dealt in fantasy. The invisible man was gone, and in his place was someone who'd learned that the best revenge isn't always getting even. Sometimes it's just being better than you ever thought you could be. And every time someone tries to steal from me again, they'd better hope I'm still willing to build them a fake file instead of a real lawsuit. Because now I'm the one behind the wheel, and I plan to stay there.